Grandma's treehouse sheltered a veteran and his dog until they discovered a $220 million secret. The road narrowed into gravel just past the rusted county line sign. Ethan Cole gripped the steering wheel tighter as his truck jostled over potholes, pine branches slapping at the windshield. Beside him, Ranger sat alert in the passenger seat, ears stiff, nose twitching. The German shepherd hadn't taken his eyes off the tree line for the last mile. They hadn't spoken. Not really. Ethan wasn't much for words these days. 45, battle-worn, and tired in places most people couldn't see. His right leg throbbed from old shrapnel buried near the knee. His hands bore calluses from years of labor after the war. And his eyes, once sharp and eager, had dimmed with the weight of memory. PTSD, the VA had called it. Ghosts, he called it. The town of Willow Ridge had faded just like him. Empty storefronts, an old gas station with only one working pump, a church whose steeple leaned sideways like it was tired of praying. But the forest? The forest still stood. And deep inside it, somewhere just beyond the last bend, was the treehouse his grandmother June had built by hand nearly 5 decades ago. Ethan eased the truck to a stop. The engine ticked in the sudden silence. Mist drifted low across the clearing. The great oak loomed ahead, its massive branches twisted with age, and halfway up, clinging like a forgotten memory, was the treehouse. Weathered, slanted, but still intact. Ranger let out a low growl. Ethan looked down at him. "What is it?" The dog's amber eyes were locked on the base of the tree. His body stiffened, muscles taut under his coat. "Easy," Ethan muttered, opening the truck door. The air bit cold. Pine and wet earth filled his lungs. As he stepped out, the forest seemed to hush, like it was holding its breath. Ranger leapt down beside him, nose to the ground, circling the oak's base. His growl deepened. Ethan followed, brow furrowed. The base of the oak was gnarled with roots and overgrowth. Blackberry vines curled like barbed wire. But there, just beneath the lowest branch, something caught the light. He pushed aside a tangle of vines, a shallow depression in the bark. Unnatural. Carved. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent. Ethan crouched, ran his fingers along the groove. It was a symbol, faint but deliberate. A triangle with a slash through it. He'd seen that mark before, on an old ledger his grandmother kept hidden beneath the kitchen sink. A code, maybe, or a warning. He glanced up at the treehouse. From this angle, it looked like a relic held together by memory and stubborn wood. But something shifted in his gut. This wasn't just a structure from his past. It was something more. Ranger whined beside him, pawing at the dirt. "You think there's something here?" The dog barked again, 2 short bursts. Ethan stood slowly, eyes sweeping the clearing. No one around. Just the wind threading through the pines. He grabbed his duffel from the truck, slung it over his shoulder, and approached the old rope ladder. Half the rungs looked rotten, the other half just looked angry. Ranger stayed below, pacing. "You coming or staying, soldier?" The dog tilted his head, then leapt, claws scrambling against the tree trunk. Somehow he made it halfway up before jumping onto the lower platform like he'd done it 1,000 times. Ethan chuckled under his breath. Show off. The climb was harder than he remembered. His legs screamed with each step. Sweat beaded along his temples despite the cold. But the boards held. When he pulled himself over the ledge, he froze. Inside the treehouse, dust floated like fog. The wood groaned beneath his boots. But there was something else. A smell. Not rot. Not mold. Something sharp. Faintly metallic. Ranger stood in the far corner, nose pressed to the wall. His tail was stiff, not wagging. "What now?" Ethan asked, kneeling beside him. The dog scratched once at the wall. Then again. Ethan leaned in. The panel looked no different than the others, but when he knocked, hollow. He grabbed the flathead screwdriver from his bag, wedged it into the seam. The panel resisted, then gave with a dry pop. Behind it, nestled in a crevice carved into the tree itself, was a small wooden box. Old, dark. The corners were scorched, and the latch was rusted shut. Ethan stared. Ranger whined. He sat back on his heels. The wind picked up outside, rattling the treehouse. The box sat between them like a heartbeat. He hadn't even been here 10 minutes, and already the tree was whispering secrets. Rain came before dawn, steady and cold, the kind that made the woods smell like iron and earth. Ethan woke to the sound of it drumming on the roof of the old treehouse. The air inside was damp, his breath visible in the grey light that leaked through the cracks. Ranger lay beside him, head on his paws, eyes half open but alert. For a moment, everything was still. Then Ranger's ears twitched. He rose suddenly, nose working, body rigid. A low growl vibrated in his chest. Ethan sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "What is it now?" he muttered. Ranger padded to the wall near the ladder, the same place he'd been sniffing yesterday. He scratched once, then again, harder this time, claws scraping against the wood. Ethan frowned. He grabbed his flashlight, knelt, and pressed his ear to the wall. The faint, hollow thud returned. He remembered the box from last night, the one still sitting unopened beside his duffel. Maybe this wasn't the only secret the old tree was keeping. Ranger turned and barked once, sharp and commanding. Then he moved to the corner where the trunk's roots split through the floor, sniffing the same patch of dirt again and again. The boards creaked under his weight. "You're serious about this, huh?" Ethan said quietly. The dog didn't look at him. He just kept digging, paws sending dust and pine needles flying. Ethan sighed, pushed himself to his feet, and grabbed his work gloves. He pried up one of the loose planks. Beneath it, the soil was dark and packed with years of decay. Ranger dug harder, his movements quick and sure, tail stiff, every muscle tuned to something unseen. Then his paw hit wood. A soft thump echoed through the floor. Ethan froze. "Hold on." He pushed Ranger back gently, brushing away the dirt with his hands. A small wooden box lay buried there, wedged into a hollow between the roots. The lid was sealed with wax, edges rough, the surface carved with the same faint triangle and slash mark they'd found outside. His pulse kicked. Ranger stood over him, panting lightly, eyes locked on the box. Ethan whispered, "You found this." He pulled out his knife, scraped the brittle seal until it cracked. The hinges protested, but gave way. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed cloth, were 5 gold coins. Old, heavy, stamped with symbols of a world long gone. Beneath them, a folded piece of paper, creased from age. Ethan unfolded it with careful fingers. The handwriting was delicate, looping, his grandmother's. "My dear Ethan, if you are reading this, it means you have returned when life has grown too heavy to carry. I could not leave you much, but I saved what I could, piece by piece, when no one else thought these scraps worth keeping. There are deeper secrets in this tree, but not all are meant to be found at once. Trust your instincts. You will need them when there's nothing else left to hold on to. Love, June." Ethan stared at the page until the ink blurred. His chest tightened. The handwriting was real. He knew every curl of it. But what did she mean by deeper secrets? And how had she hidden gold here? She'd never even owned a credit card. Ranger nudged his arm, breaking his trance. The dog's head rested against his sleeve, eyes calm, patient. Ethan let out a rough breath. "You think there's more, don't you?" Ranger didn't move, but his gaze said enough. Ethan turned the coins in his palm. They gleamed faintly in the grey light. Each one was stamped with an eagle and a Latin phrase. He could feel their weight, real, undeniable. For a long while he sat in silence. Rain trickled through the cracks, dripping onto the boards. The forest whispered outside, branches swaying like they knew something he didn't. He thought about June, her soft voice, the way she'd hum old hymns while cooking. She'd never talked about wealth or hidden things. Just about working hard, keeping faith, surviving the lean years. Yet she had buried gold under the treehouse like a war spy hiding intel. It made no sense, unless there was something she'd been protecting. Ranger suddenly barked again, this time facing the window. Ethan tensed. He followed Ranger's gaze out toward the clearing. Through the veil of rain, a figure moved between the trees. Too far to make out, too still to be casual. The shape lingered for several seconds, then disappeared into the fog. Ethan's heart thudded once, hard. He rose slowly, every nerve alert. Looks like someone else found their way back, he muttered. Ranger's hackles lifted. He stood ready, silent now, eyes locked on the forest. Ethan crouched beside him, resting a hand on the dog's back. He could feel the tension coiled in those muscles, the same readiness he'd seen in trained soldiers. "We'll check it out at first light," Ethan whispered. "Not tonight." Ranger gave a low rumble, almost reluctant, but obeyed. Ethan wrapped the coins and letter back into the box, sealed it with a strip of duct tape, and slid it into his pack. Then he pulled the old pistol from his duffel, the one he'd kept more out of habit than hope, and checked the chamber. 1 clip. Enough for warning shots if it came to that. The rain eased near dawn. Mist rose from the ground, thick and heavy. Ethan barely slept. Ranger didn't sleep at all. When the first sliver of daylight cut through the trees, Ethan stepped outside with his coffee mug. The air was cold enough to sting. Ranger circled the base of the tree again, nose low, tail straight. Then he stopped, rigid, staring at the exact spot where the carved symbol was burned into the bark. Ethan followed, unease twisting through him. The mark looked the same as yesterday, until he crouched closer. Something new was etched beneath it, a single line, fresh, carved into the wood during the night. Someone had been there. Ranger growled softly, teeth bared. Ethan straightened, scanning the woods. Nothing moved, but the silence felt different now, watchful. He glanced down at his dog, who was already standing between him and the forest. "All right, partner," he whispered. "Looks like your instincts were right." Ranger's tail flicked once, steady, like an answer. And for the first time since coming home, Ethan felt that old pulse of adrenaline, the soldier's instinct that said, this wasn't over. Something had woken in the woods, and it had started with the dog. The sun broke through the trees for the first time in days, throwing narrow bands of gold across the clearing. Ethan stood on the ladder, hammer in hand, his breath misting in the cool air. The roof needed patching, and the boards inside were swollen with years of rain. Ranger lay on the platform beside him, chin on his paws, but eyes never still, tracking every flicker of light in the woods. They had spent 2 days cleaning the treehouse, dragging out old crates, sweeping away dust thick as memory. It felt almost livable again, but every sound in the forest still made Ethan's pulse quicken. He wasn't afraid of much anymore. War had burned that out of him, but something about this place carried an unease he couldn't name. As he nailed the final plank into the floor, the hammer slipped from his hand. It struck the boards with a dull thud, not the solid thunk of old oak, but something hollow. Ethan froze. Ranger's ears perked. Immediately, head lifting, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Ethan crouched and tapped the spot again. Hollow. "Ranger," he murmured, "we might have found something." The dog stood, tail stiff, eyes locked on the floor like he could see through it. Ethan pried up a board with the claw of his hammer. Beneath, a layer of dust-covered planks formed a false bottom. He scraped the dirt away and saw the corner of something metal glinting faintly. He worked slowly, lifting each piece until the shape emerged. A steel chest, heavy and cold, edges rusted but intact. It looked old, the kind of box soldiers once carried maps or munitions in. Ranger padded closer and sniffed, ears flat, uncertain. "Yeah," Ethan whispered. "I feel it too." He tried the latch. It didn't budge. He fetched a crowbar from his bag, wedged it under the seam, and pressed his weight against it. The metal screeched, the sound sharp in the quiet morning. When it finally gave, a thin cloud of dust rose from the gap. Inside lay bundles wrapped in oilcloth, neatly stacked. Ethan's pulse quickened. He peeled back the first layer. Paper, old stock certificates, some printed, some handwritten, all stamped with names that tugged at recognition. Apple Computer Inc., Microsoft Corporation, Amazon. He lifted one sheet and squinted at the date, 1986. What the hell? He dug deeper. Beneath the papers, gold bars gleamed dully in the sunlight that filtered through the cracks. There were more envelopes, bank statements, bearer bonds, certificates of deposit, each one older than he was. The smell of paper and metal filled the small space. Ranger whined softly, tail twitching, sensing Ethan's heartbeat speed up. Ethan sat back, staring at the pile. He wasn't a financial man, but he could read enough to understand. This wasn't just a stash. It was a fortune. A life-changing, world-shifting fortune. He whispered, "This has to be worth hundreds of millions." His voice echoed in the hollow room. He looked again at the certificates, names of companies that now ruled the modern world. If the shares were real, if they'd never been sold, their combined value could buy half the town of Willow Ridge. He rubbed a hand over his face, mind spinning. June Cole, his grandmother, had lived and died with nothing more than a small pension and a vegetable garden. She'd sewn clothes for neighbors, traded jam for bread, never once owned a new car. And yet, here in her treehouse, lay a fortune greater than anything he'd ever imagined. It didn't make sense. "Ranger," he said, voice tight, "what did she do?" The dog didn't move. He was sitting perfectly still now, gaze fixed not on the box but on the open window beyond it. His body went rigid, muscles tensed. Ethan followed his gaze. Outside, the forest was calm, no movement, no sound. Then a branch snapped, sharp and close. He reached instinctively for the pistol on the table. The silence stretched. Ranger's eyes never left the tree line. Then, after a few heartbeats, a raven burst from the canopy and flew off, black wings cutting through the light. Ethan exhaled, slow. "You're keeping me honest, huh?" Ranger turned back to him, tail flicking once, but his gaze lingered on the shadows. Ethan looked down at the chest again. The light caught the edge of a sealed envelope lying at the bottom, separate from the rest. He picked it up. The handwriting was familiar, his grandmother's looping cursive. He broke the waxed seal and unfolded the letter. "My dear Ethan, if you found this, it means you were meant to. The papers and gold are not what they seem. They were not gifts of chance, but the result of choices that weighed heavy on me. What you see here belongs to no one until it serves someone. Wealth is nothing unless it gives life. Be wise in how you use it and beware. Others will come for it when they sense its worth. Not all secrets stay buried. June." The last line hit him harder than the rest. Others will come. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into his jacket pocket. His hands were trembling. He'd been trained for combat, for chaos, for the noise of war, but not for this kind of quiet threat, one that moved unseen, whispering from the past. Ranger pawed the floor once, a subtle reminder. "I know," Ethan said softly. "We can't stay here long." He rewrapped the papers, locked the chest as best he could, and slid it back into its hiding place. He replaced the boards, hammered them down, every thud ringing through the still air like a drum beat. Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling the trees. The forest no longer felt empty. Ethan stood at the window, looking out across the clearing, Ranger sitting beside him. The old man's instincts, the ones that had kept him alive in deserts and ambushes, stirred awake. Something was coming. He could feel it in the way the forest breathed, in the way Ranger refused to relax. He rested a hand on the dog's head. "You found gold, buddy," he said quietly. "But I think we just dug up trouble." Ranger's ears twitched, his gaze never wavering from the dark woods below. And for the first time, Ethan knew the real fight hadn't even begun. The diner in Willow Ridge hadn't changed in 20 years. The same peeling teal booths, the same cracked linoleum floor, the same scent of burnt coffee and fried eggs floating in the air. Ethan Cole sat in the corner booth, hat low over his brow, Ranger curled at his feet beneath the table. The waitress had brought Ranger a bowl of water without asking. Grace Holloway slid into the seat across from him, rain dripping from her blazer sleeves. Her auburn hair was pulled back, but a few stubborn strands clung to her cheeks. She looked tired. Not the kind that came from sleep deprivation, but the kind that came from years of fighting for people the world forgot. "You're lucky I still pick up unknown numbers," she said, setting a manila folder on the table between them. "But something in your voice told me it wasn't just a social call." Ethan nodded once. "It's not." Ranger shifted under the table. Grace glanced down, then smiled softly and leaned to scratch behind his ears. "You still keeping this one close?" "Closer than most people," Ethan said. She pulled her hands back and flipped open the folder. "I ran a quick background on the property deed. Last transfer was 18 years ago. June Cole. No liens, no disputes, no easements. But the rest, that's where it gets strange." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Strange how? Your grandmother wasn't as poor as everyone thought." Grace tapped a photocopied bank statement. She had multiple offshore accounts. Not illegal, just quiet. She bought blue-chip stocks in the early 80s. Apple, Microsoft, even Amazon pre-IPO. Never sold, never touched, just held on to them. Ethan stared at her, stunned. She lived off canned beans and old blankets. She traded vegetables for milk. Grace leaned in, voice low. "Which means she didn't want anyone to know. Maybe not even you. Someone taught her how to invest. She was precise, patient. She buried wealth so deep no one would suspect. And now it's yours." Ranger stirred again, ears twitching. Ethan rubbed a thumb along the rim of his coffee cup. "I found a letter. Said there were more secrets in the tree. Said I'd need them when I had nothing else to hold on to." Grace's gaze sharpened. "Then you'd better believe others might come looking too. Secrets like that never stay buried long." As if on cue, the bell above the diner door jingled. A tall man in a grey overcoat stepped in, dripping wet, shaking off the storm like a wolf shedding its coat. His eyes scanned the room once, cold, calculating, before settling on Ethan. Ethan stiffened. Ranger's head lifted under the table. The man didn't approach. He simply ordered a coffee and took the booth across the room, facing Ethan directly. A show of presence, not conversation. Grace lowered her voice. "Who is he?" "No idea, but he was watching the treehouse last night. Ranger didn't like him then either." "Do you think he knows?" "I think he's guessing, and I think he's waiting for me to slip up." Grace's fingers tapped the folder once more, then slid a business card across the table. That's my direct line. If anything happens, you call. Don't wait. I can file injunctions, lock down the property, bury it in legal barriers so thick they'll suffocate before they touch it." Ethan nodded, tucking the card into his coat. Outside, the rain thickened. Thunder rolled low in the hills. They stepped out together under the awning. The man in the overcoat remained inside, still watching. Grace glanced toward Ethan's truck. "You said you found gold, too." "And documents, dozens, real, heavy, old." She left instructions, but no map. Just faith. "You think she expected you to find them?" Ethan looked down at Ranger. The dog stood like a statue, eyes locked on the man in the diner. He gave a short huff, more breath than bark, but filled with tension. "She knew I'd come back when I had nowhere else to go." Ethan said, "She always saw further than the rest of us." Grace touched his arm. "Whatever she left, it was meant to build something, not to bury you with it." As they parted, another car crept down the street. A woman in sunglasses sat behind the wheel, watching. Ethan didn't recognize her either. That made 3 strangers in 2 days. Ranger growled. Ethan whispered, "We've stirred the hornet's nest, haven't we?" Back at the treehouse, the light had changed. Clouds rolled over the ridge, casting long shadows between the trunks. Ethan stood at the base of the ladder, scanning the edge of the woods. Ranger stood beside him, unmoving. He spotted it then, just for a second. A glint of metal, far back through the trees. Binoculars, maybe. Someone watching. He turned to Ranger. "All right, from now on, we work in silence, and we don't trust anyone unless they've earned it." That night he sat beside the lantern inside the treehouse, Grace's folder open beside him, maps and deeds and letters strewn across the floor. The documents didn't just tell a story of wealth. They told a story of intent. June Cole hadn't saved that fortune for herself. She'd saved it for a purpose. But purpose came with weight, and that weight was beginning to shift. Ranger lay across the hatch to the floor compartment, body still, ears listening for every branch that snapped in the dark. And outside, in the deep woods, the shadows no longer stayed still. The man arrived just after noon, crisp and quiet, like the start of a thunderstorm before the first drop hits. Ethan was at the base of the treehouse, driving a new support beam into place, when he heard the unmistakable crunch of polished shoes on pine needles. Ranger stood first. Not barked, stood. His whole body taut, ears pointed forward, tail down. Ethan turned slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. The man was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, black leather gloves, and shoes that had no business walking woodland soil. He carried a slim briefcase and wore a half-smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Mr. Cole," he said, stopping at a respectable distance. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," Ethan said flatly. The man chuckled politely. "Understandable. My name is Calder Mays. I represent a small consortium with interest in your grandmother's estate." Ranger growled, low and guttural, the kind of sound that didn't bluff. Mays glanced at the dog, then looked back at Ethan. "You found something of considerable value." Ethan's jaw flexed. He didn't answer. Mays stepped forward slowly, as if rehearsed. "We don't want conflict, Mr. Cole. We want resolution. My clients are prepared to offer you a clean number, $8 million, tax-free, no media, no legal strings, just a wire transfer, and you walk away." Ranger barked once, sharp and loud. Ethan didn't flinch. He met Mays's gaze, steady as stone. "You know," Ethan said, voice quiet. "I've met a lot of men like you, usually overseas, always smiling, always talking about resolutions, and they all had the same look in their eyes, the kind that gets people killed." Mays's smile didn't fade, but something flickered behind it. 8 million. He repeated. Cash. Ethan stepped closer. Ranger matched his pace, staying half a step ahead, body between them. This land's not for sale. Neither is what's under it. Mays tilted his head. Don't be hasty. These offers don't stay on the table long. Ethan reached into his belt loop and pulled out a rusted wrench. Not a weapon, but not nothing. He held it casually, but deliberately. You've got until I count to 3 to turn around. Mays didn't move. 1. He blinked. 2. Mays took a slow step back, then another. You're making a mistake. 3. Ranger lunged, not to bite, just to make his point. Mays flinched hard and stumbled into the underbrush, catching his coat on a thorn bush. His shoes made sloppy sounds as he retreated across the clearing. Ethan didn't follow. He waited until the sound of footsteps disappeared. Only then did he whisper, You heard it, didn't you, boy? Ranger looked up at him, then back towards the trees, hackles still raised. That night Ethan couldn't sleep. Every rustle outside became a footstep. Every shadow a shape that didn't belong. By morning Ranger was pacing. Not restless, alert. At the edge of the clearing he froze, nose to the ground. Ethan watched as the dog sniffed a bush near the tree's base. Then he growled and jumped into it, teeth snapping. A soft metallic clink echoed in the air. Ethan ran over. Ranger had already pawed something loose. A small black device, lens glinting in the sunlight. A camera, hidden. He crushed it under his boot. Later that day he called Grace. She answered on the second ring. I need you to run a name. Ethan said. Who? Calder Mays. Expensive suit. Knows too much. Said he represents a consortium interested in my grandmother's land. He heard the sound of keys tapping. Then a pause. Found him. Calder Mays. Disbarred lawyer. 4 years ago involved in a fraudulent estate settlement in Tennessee. Made millions off forged wills and coerced heirs. Charges were dropped. Witness vanished. No conviction. Ethan swallowed hard. So he's not just fishing. No, he's hunting. Grace said. And you just told him the meat's real. They sat in silence for a moment. I'll file a harassment report, she added. But that won't stop him. Men like Mays don't scare easy. Neither do I. Later that night, Ethan sat on the treehouse floor, shotgun across his lap, Ranger beside him. The light of the lantern cast long shadows across the walls. He whispered. He knew what was here, or enough to bluff. Ranger looked at him, eyes steady. Loyal! But how did he know where to look? Ranger blinked. Ethan leaned back against the wall, feeling the weight of the wood around him. The treehouse creaked like an old memory. He thought of June, of her quiet voice, her garden-stained fingers, her eyes that never missed anything. If she knew they'd come, what else had she prepared? Outside, the wind shifted. The scent of smoke and something else, cheap cologne, maybe, lingered in the air. Ranger stood, walked to the door, and stared out into the night. And Ethan knew then. The storm wasn't coming. It had already begun. The storm arrived without warning. By the time Ethan noticed the air had changed, the treehouse was already trembling from the low growl of thunder rolling through the hills. Rain slammed against the roof, washing the windows in streaks of silver. The light inside flickered as wind hissed through the cracks. Ranger paced near the door, tail stiff, ears pinned back. His body was all muscle and tension, head low, breathing shallow. Ethan stood at the center of the room, holding his phone in one hand, a half-written note to Grace on the screen. The bars disappeared one by one until the screen read, No signal. That was the first sign. The second came seconds later. Ranger froze. He moved with purpose to the window facing the clearing. He growled, low, deep, and guttural. Not fear, not confusion, a warning. Ethan dropped the phone and followed him, peering through the dark. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the clearing for a single heartbeat. Figures. 4 of them, maybe 5, moving like shadows just beyond the tree line. Black coats, gloves. One carried something long, a bolt cutter. Another had a crowbar. Ranger barked, loud and sharp. Then came the sound of boots squelching through mud, moving fast. Ethan grabbed the shotgun from its place under the floorboards, his fingers shaking, but steady enough to load the chamber. He didn't aim it, yet. He looked at Ranger. The dog's gaze wasn't on the men outside. It was locked on a specific plank in the floor. He scratched it once, looked at Ethan, then scratched again. The tunnel. June's escape hatch. Ethan dropped to one knee and yanked the panel open. The scent of wet earth and old wood rose up to meet him. The space was tight, just enough to crawl, and dark as pitch. A crack echoed from below. The first intruder had reached the base of the tree. A second voice shouted, drowned by thunder. Then came the creak of the rope ladder under heavy weight. Ethan crouched, looked into Ranger's eyes. Down. Now. The dog didn't hesitate. He dropped into the tunnel like he'd trained for it. Ethan followed, pulling the hatch closed above him just as the trapdoor shook from the weight of a boot. The tunnel walls pressed close, timber beams lining the ceiling. Every few feet, roots reached down like fingers. The only light came from the dim beam of Ethan's flashlight, bouncing wildly with each shuffle. Ranger moved ahead in silence. His body brushed the dirt walls, but he made no sound. He knew this space better than Ethan did, like he had always known. Behind them, faint thuds echoed through the wood. Voices shouted. Someone cursed. The attackers were inside. Ethan pushed harder. His shoulders scraped. His boots sank into wet mud. The tunnel angled slightly upward, and he remembered June's old map. The exit led to a downed pine, 200 yards from the clearing. Ranger stopped suddenly. Ethan almost slammed into him. The dog clawed once at the wood above, then backed away. Ethan pressed up and pushed. The hatch groaned, then popped open, sending leaves and rain spilling into the tunnel. He climbed out into a mess of storm and wind. Ranger emerged right after, shaking himself once, then turning to face the direction of the treehouse. Lightning tore through the sky again. The house stood in silhouette, flashlights moving through the windows like restless spirits. Shadows of men passed behind the glass, searching. Ethan pulled the satellite phone from his jacket, the one Grace had insisted he carry. No dial tone. But after 3 tense seconds, a bar flickered to life. He hit speed dial. "Sheriff Dalton," came the voice, low and groggy. "Cal, it's Ethan. My place. Armed men, 4, maybe 5. Broke in. We're safe, but I need backup. Now." Dalton's voice sharpened. "You hurt?" "No, but they came prepared. Bring everyone." "On my way. Sit tight." Ethan closed the phone and turned to Ranger. The dog didn't move. He was crouched, ready, eyes scanning the clearing. And then came headlights, distant but growing. The sound of engines pushing through mud. Sheriff Dalton's truck burst through the trees, followed by 2 cruisers. Spotlights hit the treehouse like floodlights on a stage. The intruders panicked. Ethan watched from the shadows as they scrambled for the ladder, 2 of them leaping from the side and rolling in the mud. Deputies shouted commands, weapons drawn. One man raised a pistol. He didn't get the chance to use it. Dalton tackled him to the ground like an old linebacker with something to prove. The others surrendered fast. Within minutes, the cuffs clicked. The rain poured harder. Flashlights swept through the clearing, illuminating crowbars, a duffel bag full of lock-picking tools, a rifle wrapped in plastic. Ethan stepped from the woods just as Dalton turned to him. The sheriff looked older than Ethan remembered, white stubble thick along his jaw, eyes ringed with fatigue. But his grip was still strong as they clasped forearms. "You all right?" Ethan nodded. "Thanks for getting here fast." Dalton looked up at the treehouse. Hell of a place to pick a fight. Ranger padded between them, then trotted over to the fallen rifle and sat beside it, tail stiff. Dalton followed his gaze and let out a low whistle. Smart dog. Ethan looked back at the house. Its windows glowed from the deputies, lights. Its door hung half open. Scratches marked the frame. Everything's changed now, he said. Dalton raised an eyebrow. You thinking about leaving? No, Ethan replied. I'm thinking about doing the one thing they didn't expect. Which is going public. Ranger looked up at him, ears forward, like he understood every word. The storm had come and gone. But the war? That was just beginning. And this time, Ethan wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was stepping into the light. The treehouse didn't burn that night, but something else did. Quietly, steadily. The last trace of hiding. By morning, the scent of wet ash still clung to the boards, even though the fire never came. But Ethan knew something had ended. Not just the siege, not just the illusion of safety. He stood beneath the oak, eyes on the splintered doorway, the claw marks left by strangers with crowbars and bad intentions. And he knew he couldn't keep this secret buried anymore. Grace arrived before noon, wearing her signature navy blazer and boots muddied from the trail. She didn't say much at first, just stared up at the battered structure and exhaled. You gonna rebuild it? She asked. Ethan looked at her, then back at the treehouse. No. She raised an eyebrow. I'm going to turn it into something new. He said it without thinking, but as soon as the words left his mouth, he felt the truth in them. That night, they sat under the open sky at the old picnic bench, surrounded by scattered files, blueprints, and coffee mugs gone cold. Ranger lay between them, head resting on his paws, eyes flicking between the woods and Ethan's face. What if? Ethan said, tapping the end of his pen against the edge of a blueprint. We don't just fix what's broken. What if we build something for people like me? People who come home but don't really make it back. Grace listened quietly. We use the money, Ethan continued. All of it. June didn't bury it for greed. She buried it for timing. Maybe this is what she was waiting for. Grace nodded slowly. A veterans center? More than that. A safe house. Job programs. Outreach. For the ones left behind. Soldiers, single mothers, kids who fell through the cracks. Grace reached across the table, tapped a blank section of the blueprint. What do we call it? Ethan didn't hesitate. The June Foundation. From that moment, things moved fast. Grace took point on paperwork, weaving through red tape like a blade through cloth. Non-profit status, legal protections, land use permits. Her voice became a steady fixture at the county office. When people asked why she was doing it, she simply said, because someone has to. Ethan handled the structure. With the help of a few local contractors, old friends, one-time classmates, he rebuilt the treehouse from the inside out. Reinforced supports, a new roof, secure windows. But he kept the original frame. The heart of it. The soul June had left behind. And Ranger, he became something else entirely. The locals started calling him the Sentinel. It began as a joke, but it stuck. People swore he could tell the difference between strangers and good men before a word was said. He patrolled the perimeter every morning, never missing a step. When the first group of volunteers arrived, a mix of veterans and young men from the county vocational school, Ranger walked between them like an instructor. They gave him space. They respected him. And he watched over the gold. Not the coins, but what they built with it. The foundation's first project was a small cabin 30 yards from the treehouse. 2 rooms, a shared kitchen, warm lights in the windows. It welcomed a mother and her 2 daughters fleeing an abusive home. No press, no photos, just a key. a bed, and the sound of wind through the pines. Ethan stood in the treehouse that night, Ranger by his side, watching the lights from the cabin flicker through the trees. "She's safe now," he whispered. Ranger blinked slowly, as if in agreement. By spring, the June Foundation had 5 employees. Grace became its executive director, dividing her time between legal clinics and foundation planning. A workshop was under construction near the riverbank, where veterans could teach mechanical skills, woodworking, and electrical trades. The local school agreed to partner with the program. And still, the treehouse remained the heart of it all. It no longer felt like a place to hide. It felt like command, strategy, vision. One afternoon, Ethan hosted a meeting there with 2 county commissioners. As they walked up the rebuilt ladder, Ranger led the way, then sat beside the door, staring down at the clearing like he could read the horizon. The men noticed. "Is he always like that?" one of them asked. Ethan smiled. "He doesn't miss much." They didn't laugh. They nodded, serious. They understood. Word spread. Donations came in, slowly but sincerely. Small checks from church groups, anonymous envelopes left at the gate, even an old man from 3 counties over who sent $20 and a note that read, "I once knew June. She helped me when I had nothing. Seems right to return the favor." The house that June built now stood taller than ever. Every plank restored, every window opened. It wasn't camouflage anymore, it was a lighthouse. One evening, as the sun set behind the ridgeline, Ethan and Grace stood at the edge of the clearing. Construction dust clung to their jeans. Ranger sat between them, his coat catching the last rays of gold light. "You think she'd be proud?" Grace asked. Ethan didn't answer right away. He just looked up at the treehouse. "She didn't leave me a fortune," he said finally. "She left me a reason." Ranger barked once, a sharp sound that broke the stillness. Then he trotted off toward the path, head high, tail steady. Someone new was coming down the trail. Ranger already knew. And the June Foundation stood ready to receive them. The morning sun broke clean over Willow Ridge. No longer filtered through layers of fog and forgotten time, it poured gold across the clearing, casting long shadows that moved with life, not ghosts. A year had passed. Where once stood weeds and caution tape, now stood something else entirely. The treehouse, still perched in its mighty oak, no longer looked like a relic from a broken past. Its wood gleamed with new varnish, and a handmade sign hung at its base, carved simply, "The June Foundation." Below it, in smaller letters, shelter, skill, purpose. Children's laughter echoed across the yard. They darted between the raised garden beds and the old pine stump, where volunteers had carved out a small playground. A boy in a red hoodie swung from the low-hanging branch. A girl in braids chased a brown puppy across the open space. Near the far edge of the property, a wooden barn had been converted into a working dog training center. The air buzzed with whistles and commands. Veterans stood in a circle, each with a leash in hand, learning how to train service dogs, not just for others, but for themselves. Ranger stood at the center of them all, no leash, no collar. The old shepherd was grayer now, his muzzle touched with silver, his eyes softer, but he still moved with command. Each morning he did his rounds, first the cabins, then the main house, then the treehouse itself. And always, the training ring. He was never told where to go. He just knew. That morning, he stopped beside a young man in fatigues. The man stood stiffly, uncertain, a Labrador puppy tugging at his shoelaces. Ranger nudged the man's leg with his nose, then sat. The veteran knelt slowly and scratched behind Ranger's ears. The puppy stopped tugging. Across the field, Ethan Cole stood near the flagpole, sipping black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. He watched the exchange and smiled. He wore a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, faded jeans, and boots worn thin at the soles. His limp was still there, but lighter now. He walked like a man who had learned how to move forward without outrunning the past. A group of younger vets approached, notebooks in hand. One of them asked about permits for the new wood shop. Another had questions about the plumbing system in the cabin dorms. Ethan listened, then guided them with a quiet authority. He was no longer the man who had arrived in Willow Ridge with only ghosts and a dog. He was the one others looked to now. Grace Holloway exited the main house with a clipboard and a phone tucked between her shoulder and cheek. Her hair was tied back in a tight bun, and her boots clicked across the gravel as she gave instructions on a shelter grant application. Yes, Section 8B should reference our trauma program. And no, we are not accepting private donors who demand naming rights. This isn't about legacy, it's about impact. She ended the call and turned, spotting Ethan across the field. She gave a nod. He nodded back. It had become their unspoken rhythm. She ran the operation now, formally, officially, efficiently, but Ethan still set the tone. Grace made sure the lights stayed on. Ethan made sure the people did. No one here got rich. The money was spent before it ever touched a bank. On food, beds, tools, medications, vet visits, dog food, therapy, hot water. But no one complained. Because for the first time, many of them had more than they'd ever hoped for. A reason to wake up. By afternoon, Ethan walked the perimeter with Ranger. The path circled the property, fence line to tree line and back again. Ranger moved slower these days, but still alert. Every squirrel got a hard stare. Every breeze carried weight. They paused at the hill overlooking the town. From there, you could see Willow Ridge's quiet rebirth. The general store had reopened. The gas station had a new awning. A new mural painted by local students stretched across the old community center wall, a silhouette of a dog standing guard under an oak tree. Ranger lay down beside Ethan, panting lightly. "You tired, old man?" Ethan asked. Ranger thumped his tail once. No bark, just acknowledgement. They sat for a while, Ethan's hand resting gently on Ranger's back. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. A bird chirped somewhere high above. Then came the soft crunch of gravel behind them. A girl, maybe 10 or 11, stood there, holding a sketch pad. She had freckles and nervous eyes. She glanced at Ranger, then at Ethan. "Is he the one?" she asked. "The one. The dog from the story. The one who saved the treasure." Ethan looked at Ranger, who raised his head slowly, ears half-cocked. "Yeah," Ethan said softly. "He's the one." The girl smiled, shy. "I'm drawing him, for art class." "Make sure you draw him taller than the treehouse," Ethan said. "That's how big he is in this place." She nodded solemnly and ran off. Ethan looked down at Ranger, whose eyes were closed again. "You're not just guarding gold anymore, buddy," he murmured. "You're guarding what it became." Ranger didn't move, but Ethan knew he heard. And in the peace of that moment, of distant laughter, healing work, warm sun, and the old heartbeat of a town finding itself again, Ethan Cole finally understood the real legacy June had left behind. It wasn't money or land. It was the space for people to start over. And the dog who never stopped watching. They arrived in 2 white school vans, dust trailing behind them like a banner of curiosity. 24 middle school students from across the state. Most of them city kids who had never walked a dirt path without sidewalks or seen a treehouse that didn't belong in a theme park. Their sneakers hit the gravel with the excitement of a field trip. Phones snapped pictures of the towering oak, of the carved wooden sign, of the barn-turned training center and gardens blooming in the sun. But what caught every eye, what made the kids stop and go silent, was the dog. Ranger stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and still, watching the group with the quiet authority of a general. His grey muzzle gave him a noble edge, like a living statue that had once walked through fire. The chaperone, a woman with bright earrings and a clipboard, stepped forward and called to the group. "This is Mr. Ethan Cole. He's the co-founder of the June Foundation. You'll get to ask questions later, so listen close." Ethan stepped onto the porch of the treehouse, his hat in one hand, a thermos in the other. He looked down at the faces below. Some bored, some curious, some already scribbling in notebooks. "Welcome to our little patch of dirt," he said. "It used to be forgotten. Now it's something else, something we try to share." Ranger moved to stand beside him, tail swaying gently. A girl in a denim jacket whispered to her friend, pointing. Ethan heard the word famous. He smiled. "This old guy, he's the real reason any of this started." A boy near the front, quiet, thin, his hoodie sleeves too long, raised his hand. "Is it true the dog found treasure?" The question floated into the quiet. A few students snickered. One teacher frowned like she wanted to jump in, but Ethan waved her off. He looked down at Ranger, who sat, blinked, and looked out toward the woods. Ethan nodded once. "Yeah, it's true, but not the kind of treasure you're thinking." The boy tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Ethan crouched beside Ranger, resting a hand gently on the dog's shoulder. The fur there was coarse, warm beneath his fingers. "He found something more important," Ethan said. "A reason to keep going." That silenced the field. "You see," he continued, standing again, "when I first came back here I had nothing left. Not money, not hope. Just this dog and a tree full of ghosts. But Ranger, he knew. He knew there was something waiting to be found. Not just gold, not just paper, but purpose. And that's what this place became. A second chance, not just for me, for a lot of people." Another kid raised her hand. "Is that why it's called the June Foundation?" Ethan nodded. "My grandmother's name. She built this treehouse herself with salvaged wood and blistered hands. She believed in people even when they didn't believe in themselves. She saved what little she had, not to escape, but to plant something bigger." The boy with the hoodie scribbled quickly in a worn spiral notebook. At the end of the tour, he stayed behind. Ethan was locking up the supply shed when the boy approached. "Mr. Cole," he said, voice soft. Ethan turned. "Yeah? I'm writing about this for my class project. Is it okay if I tell the whole story? About the dog, and the gold, and the house?" Ethan smiled. "Tell it all. Just make sure you say it wasn't about getting rich. It was about getting right." The boy nodded slowly. "I think I understand that." He looked at Ranger, who was lying beneath the porch, one eye open, still guarding without trying. "Can I draw him too?" Ethan grinned. "If you can catch him sitting still long enough." The boy pulled a pencil from his backpack and crouched right there in the dirt, sketchpad balanced on his knees. Ranger didn't move, just watched, ears flicking with the breeze. Ethan stood in the shade of the treehouse, arms crossed, watching them both. He remembered the first time he'd seen that dog in motion, back when he was just a shadow at the shelter, pacing, silent, unreadable. Now Ranger was legend, not because he barked loud, but because he never stopped listening. By the time the vans pulled away, the boy had left a copy of his sketch with Ethan. Just a rough outline. A dog beneath a treehouse. But the caption scribbled underneath said it all. The dog that found something more important than treasure. Ethan stood for a long time after the vans were gone. Ranger lay beside him, tail still. The story wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the kid with the sketchpad. And maybe someday to someone else after him. That was the point. Legacies weren't what you held, they were what you passed on. The afternoon sun filtered gently through the pine canopy, soft and golden, brushing light across the clearing like an artist finishing a canvas. It was the first day of spring. The wind still carried a chill, but the air smelled of promise, damp earth, fresh blossoms, and the smoke of distant campfires. Ethan Cole sat on the front steps of the old treehouse, a mug of warm tea in his hand. The porch creaked beneath him. He didn't mind. It was a familiar sound, part of the place now, like the breeze through the rafters or the faint chime of the wind bell Grace had hung above the door. Ranger lay beside him, his body stretched out in the sun. His coat, once thick with rich sable and black, had softened to silver around the muzzle and shoulders. His eyes still held their fire, but he moved slower these days. Deliberate. Measured. Like he knew time was something sacred. The two of them sat in silence, as they had so many times before, watching over the valley, listening to the laughter of children in the cabins below, the barking of younger dogs in training, the hammer of nails and steady rhythm of rebuilding. A voice broke the quiet. "Is he still guarding the treehouse?" Ethan looked down. A girl stood there, maybe 7 or 8, freckles on her nose, dirt on her jeans. She had one hand outstretched, gently stroking the fur on Ranger's head. The old dog didn't flinch. He blinked once, content. Ethan smiled. "No," he said. "He's not guarding the treehouse." The girl tilted her head. "He's guarding a promise." She didn't ask what that meant. She just nodded, like somehow she understood in the way children often do, without needing details. Then she sat cross-legged beside Ranger, leaning into his warmth. Above them, the radio crackled to life through the old cabin speakers. Grace's voice floated out, calm and clear. "This is Grace Holloway with the June Foundation report. Today marks 1 year since our official opening. In that time, we've housed 23 veterans, provided emergency shelter for 6 families, and trained 12 service dogs for those in need. But our numbers aren't the story. The story is what never left this place. Some truths don't die. They just wait for the right hearts to listen." Ethan closed his eyes. Let her words settle. He thought about the letter June had left, tucked behind that hidden panel. He thought about the gold, the stocks, the temptation. He thought about the storm, the siege, the long nights when he didn't think he'd make it to morning. But more than anything, he thought about what Ranger had done. He hadn't barked for attention. He hadn't fought for credit. He had simply stood his ground. For Ethan, for June, for what was right. The wind shifted. A gust stirred the wind chime. Ranger lifted his head and looked out towards the tree line, as if checking once more that all was still safe. Ethan followed his gaze, then nodded. "Still guarding," he whispered. "Always will be." The girl reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn journal, the kind kids keep secrets in. She scribbled something with a stubby pencil, tongue between her teeth. Then she looked up. "I'm going to write about him for school," she said. "Not because he's famous, but because he didn't stop when it got hard." Ethan's chest tightened. He didn't speak, just reached down and scratched Ranger behind the ear. The old shepherd leaned into his hand, heavy and sure. As the screen of time begins to fade, let this stay etched in memory. A man once came back to a broken treehouse with nothing but a dog and a wound that didn't bleed. He found more than gold. He found a reason to keep going. And the dog? He never once asked for thanks. He only asked to stay close. He didn't bark for food. He barked for the forgotten. And maybe your story has a Ranger, too. What's your story with a loyal pet? If this tale touched you, if you believe in second chances, in healing through the bond between man and dog, share this with someone who needs it. Support the channel, support the cause, and keep watching, because some guardians never leave, especially the ones with 4 legs and eyes that never look away.